On that grey October morning, Mateo arrived at school exactly at the usual time, with quiet steps and downcast eyes, as if apologizing for taking up space. He was a third-year high school student, in his final term at that traditional institution in the center of Madrid, known both for its prestige and its stifling rigidity. At 17, Mateo carried a silent routine on his shoulders. He woke up early, had a quiet breakfast with his mother, took the same bus, sat in the same desk at the back of the classroom, and returned home with his headphones on, trying to shut out the world. He never drew attention, was never late, never left an assignment undone, and yet he seemed to go unnoticed by everyone, like an opaque figure in a noisy setting. At school, he was almost a myth, the boy who never spoke, whom no one really knew, yet who never gave anyone a reason to talk about him. Professor Carrasco, on the other hand, was impossible to ignore. Tall, imposing, always wearing the same pinstriped blazer that reeked of old tobacco and authority, he walked through the classroom like a general in conquered territory. He was famous and proud of being harsh, demanding, and ruthlessly direct. Some said that he enjoyed teaching less than he enjoyed dominating. It was common for him to interrupt students with sarcastic remarks, to make cruel jokes about trivial mistakes, and to bolster his reputation as the executioner of mathematics. In Carrasco's eyes, there were two types of students: the brilliant, who deserved his attention, and the mediocre, who should be exposed until they learned their place. And on that specific day, upon seeing Mateo once again silent at the back of the room, with a distracted look and a meticulously filled notebook without ever raising his hand, he decided that it was time to bring that ghost into the spotlight. Carrasco walked to the blackboard with slow, calculated steps, as if he were about to start a show. He picked up the chalk with his fingertips, twirling it briefly between his hands, while looking at the class with an almost theatrical air. His eyes, however, were fixed on Mateo. "Let's see if silence hides wisdom or just laziness," he said, with an acidic tone that drew nervous laughs from the classmates. He drew an extensive equation, full of derivatives and complex coefficients, clearly outside the scope of that day's lesson. It was a deliberate challenge, a carefully laid trap meant to humiliate. When he finished, he turned to the back of the class and with a wry smile said loudly, "Mateo, since you like to observe in silence so much, why not come here and show us what you've learned?" The silence that followed was heavy, as if the air had grown denser. Some students exchanged glances in surprise. Others just smiled, sure that the boy would hardly open his mouth. Mateo remained motionless for a few seconds. His heart was beating so loudly he could feel it in his ears. He was not used to being noticed, much less being called to the center of attention. But for some reason, he couldn't even explain at that moment. He stood up. He walked to the board without saying a word, feeling the class's eyes like spotlights on his skin. He took the chalk that Carrasco had disdainfully offered and briefly glanced at the equation. For a moment, everything was silent. Not the awkward silence from before, but a suspended, expectant silence, as if time itself were holding its breath. Then, with an almost frightening calm, Mateo began to solve the problem, line by line, with a mathematical precision that seemed choreographed. The chalk slid along the board firmly, and the variables aligned, as if the chaos of the equation were being tamed by a mind accustomed to ordering the impossible. When he finished writing the last line of the solution, there wasn't a sound in the room. The silence was almost palpable, as if everyone were trying to understand whether that had really happened. Carrasco, who until then had maintained his confident and superior demeanor, stared at the board with slightly raised eyebrows and tightly pressed lips, a micro gesture of surprise that, coming from him, was almost a declaration of defeat. Some students began to turn to one another in disbelief, while others simply looked at Mateo as if they were seeing that face for the first time. And indeed, it was as if the boy had just been born there, at that very moment, in front of everyone, his identity completely reconfigured. Even The sound of the chalk being set aside on the shelf seemed louder than usual. Mateo, for his part, simply returned to his desk with the same serene expression, without any arrogance or vanity in his eyes. He seemed more relieved than proud, as if he had just lifted an old weight off his shoulders. Carrasco tried to regain control of the room with a comment meant to belittle, "Well, maybe it was just beginner's luck." But the phrase came out more bitter than sarcastic. The tone no longer had the same impact as before. He had lost control of the environment, and he knew it. Then, almost as an impulse of self-preservation, he decided to issue a new challenge. He picked up another piece of chalk and wrote an even longer equation, this time clearly of university level, with integrals and functions that no high school student had yet learned. "Let's see if the luck repeats itself," he said, without directly looking at Mateo. The challenge, at that moment, was no longer solely aimed at the student. It was a desperate attempt to recover the lost authority. But when Mateo stood up again, without any hesitation, the atmosphere in the room changed. The silence gave way to a contained vibration, a collective expectation. Everyone knew, deep down, that something very unusual was about to happen. Mateo walked to the board with firmer steps this time. There was still nervousness in his body, but something inside him had changed. It was as if he had discovered, even unwittingly, a place where his voice, though silent, had weight. He picked up the chalk, observed the equation closely for a few seconds, and began to solve it with the same calm as before. There was no haste in his movements, no anxiety in his eyes. It was as if he were merely solving something he already knew, as if his mind were playfully arranging variables and symbols, taming the complexity like one who organizes pieces of a puzzle. The sound of the chalk scraping the board was now the only sound in the room. "No," student dared whisper. No one looked away. Even Carrasco, who tried to maintain his rigid posture, began to slightly clench his fingers on the desk, an involuntary gesture of discomfort. The equation unfolded like a silent narrative before the entire class. And when Mateo put the final period on the solution, with a light stroke in the lower right corner of the board, the room erupted into murmurs of astonishment. Some students stood up from their seats. Others clapped spontaneously as if they themselves did not quite understand why. It was a strange, almost surreal moment, as if everyone had witnessed something extraordinary without being able to exactly name what it was. One of his classmates grabbed his cell phone and began recording the board still filled with calculations, exclaiming in a dazed voice, "Man, he solved it all! Mateo solved it all!" Others quickly followed suit, taking photos, sending messages, tagging friends in group chats. Within minutes, that moment had already escaped the four walls of the classroom and began to spread like dry fire in tall grass. And unknowingly, Mateo was beginning a day that would forever change the way he was seen, not only in that school, but throughout the country. In the corridors, the subject was unanimous. The news spread with an almost absurd speed, as if that episode were a kind of earthquake within the rigid routine of the school. Students from other classes started appearing at the classroom door, asking if it was true, wanting to see the board, trying to understand who this Mateo who humiliated Carrasco was. Even teachers from other subjects began to comment on the incident in tones of surprise, some with genuine curiosity, others with a discreet pleasure at the symbolic fall of the most arrogant member of the teaching staff. Carrasco, for his part, gathered his notes with abrupt gestures, avoiding eye contact, clearly trying to maintain his composure in a scenario that was completely out of his control. But there was no longer any control to be recovered that day. The video of the solution, filmed by one of the students, had already been shared dozens of times, even before the break. And when the next class began, Mateo was no longer just a student. He was a kind of emerging legend. But Mateo himself had not yet processed what was happening. Sitting at his desk with his eyes fixed on the floor and his hands resting on his lap, he felt a strange discomfort. It was not shame, nor exactly fear. It was a mixture of sudden exposure and an unease he could not yet name. He had never wanted to draw attention. He had never wished to be the center of anything. It was as if a too bright light had suddenly been shone on someone who had spent his life trying to remain in the shadows. His classmates began to surround him with questions, compliments, laughs, and even some shoulder pats, interactions that had not existed before and that now seemed inevitable. "Man, where did you learn all that? Are you like a hidden genius? Why have you never spoken before?" Mateo smiled awkwardly, shook his head, and said it was just a love for mathematics, but inside, everything seemed disorganized. Something had been awakened, and he still did not know whether it was a blessing or a curse. At break time, Mateo couldn't even make it to the cafeteria. At every step, someone stopped him. Classmates who had never exchanged a word with him now treated him like an old friend, wanting to know his story, making jokes, trying to strike up a conversation. Some teachers passed by him with looks that mixed curiosity and embarrassment, as if they too were trying to reorganize their own perceptions. Even the principal, a woman always serious and formal, approached him in the corridor with an enthusiastic smile and asked in front of everyone, "Were you the one who solved those equations, Mateo?" "Impressive, my boy." He only nodded, unable to find words. All that attention made him tense. Inside, he only wished he could return to the normality of anonymity, that strange comfort of being invisible. But he knew that was no longer possible. A simple problem solution had turned into a turning point he had not chosen to live. On the way home, the bus's silence seemed louder than usual. Mateo leaned against the window and watched the streets pass by with a vacant look, trying to process the whirlwind of the day. His cell phone vibrated non-stop in his pocket. Messages, notifications, groups of classmates sharing the video, people tagging him in posts to which he didn't even know how to respond. Upon arriving home, his mother noticed something in his demeanor, but did not immediately ask. She was a simple woman, soft-spoken with attentive eyes, always sensitive to her son's moods. She prepared dinner while he took off his shoes and sat on the sofa, still in silence. It was only after some time, with the food already on the plate, that she asked, "What happened today, son?" He hesitated, staring at the cutlery for a few seconds, and then answered in a low voice, "I think they discovered who I am." Mateo's mother slowly set the cutlery down, staring fixedly at him as if she already knew what that meant, even before hearing the details. She was not a woman prone to exaggerated reactions, but just by observing the way her fingers slowly intertwined on the table, one could tell that it affected her more than she let on. "What do you mean by that, son?" she asked, keeping a calm tone, but with eyes slightly moist. Then Mateo told her everything: the teacher's challenge, the solution of the equation, the second problem, the recording, the applause, the principal, the classmates. He recounted it all with a mixture of astonishment and resignation, as if he still couldn't believe his role in the story. His mother listened silently, nodding at times, frowning at others. When he finished, she remained quiet for a few seconds, as if carefully choosing what to say. "I knew that day would come," she murmured at last, almost as if speaking to herself. Mateo looked up, confused. "You knew?" he asked. And that was when something in the atmosphere of the room changed. His mother took a deep breath, got up, went to an old cupboard, and retrieved a rectangular cardboard box covered by a faded blue cloth. She placed the box on the table and opened it carefully. Inside, there were old newspaper clippings, framed certificates, rusty medals, and photos of a little boy receiving awards on improvised podiums, smiling next to suited adults. Mateo looked at all of it as if observing a forgotten memory from another life. "You were called a prodigy, remember? You won your first math Olympiad at 7. At 10, you were invited to an advanced study program. At 11, you were on television. I just thought that it was getting too big, too fast." Her voice trembled slightly. "And I was afraid. afraid that you would be seen only as a mind and not as a child. Mateo continued to look at the box, as if still trying to connect those images of the past with his present reality. It was strange to see his own history there, materialized in clippings and medals that he barely remembered receiving. The truth is that his childhood had been marked by a different pace: private lessons, interviews, invitations to scientific events. But all that had almost abruptly disappeared, as if deliberately erased. And now it made sense. His mother, with all her careful and silent love, had chosen to protect him from the pressure of being a child genius, trying to ensure that he had space to be just an ordinary boy. Mateo never questioned the disappearance of that phase of his life, perhaps because deep down he was also relieved to finally be able to breathe outside the spotlight. But now, with everything coming to light so suddenly, an internal confusion settled in. He felt gratitude, yes, but also a growing unease. Perhaps the world had been expecting something from him all along, and he didn't even know if he wanted to deliver it. With a firm yet serene look, his mother sat back down. "Son, you don't owe anyone anything, neither the world, nor me, nor your past. You don't need to follow one path just because others think it's the right one for you." Her words were simple, yet they carried weight. "I was wrong to hide everything out of fear, perhaps. But now it's you who decides what you want to be, and there's nothing wrong with wanting a peaceful life." Mateo listened intently, and those phrases echoed inside him for hours afterward. For the first time that day, he felt a kind of relief, not because he had found an answer, but because he understood that the answer could only be his, and no one else's. The next morning, Mateo woke up to his cell phone vibrating non-stop. Notifications from social media, interview requests, invitations to appear on television shows. Even a local reporter had managed to get his number and left a voicemail asking if he would agree to talk about the genius revealed in the classroom. The news had spread with full force. The video of his solution had already accumulated thousands of views, and his name now appeared in online articles with sensational titles like "The New Spanish Einstein" or "Mateo, the Invisible Prodigy." Everything seemed too surreal. He was still sitting on his bed, in pajamas, with a sleepy, puffy face, and yet he was already being treated as a national phenomenon. But inside him, the feeling was ambiguous. There was pride, of course, but also an early fatigue, as if all that recognition came with a burden he never asked to carry. At school, the situation had intensified even more. Teachers who barely noticed him before now treated him with exaggerated cordiality. Some classmates who had never spoken to him began sitting next to him, seeking closeness. Even the most popular students, who before didn't even know his last name, now greeted him in the hallways with friendly pats on the back and phrases like, "You are our pride man." And then the official invitations came, emails with university seals from abroad, personalized letters from renowned institutions such as Harvard, MIT, Cambridge, and Stanford, each one offering full scholarships, accelerated academic programs, and promises of a brilliant future. The school directors organized meetings to assist him with translations and guidance, as if they had taken on the mission of polishing that unexpected diamond. But the more compliments he received, the more Mateo felt disconnected from himself. It was as if his identity had been hijacked by an image that didn't entirely represent him. The pressure began to grow silently, yet intensely, with each new meeting with the administration, each new teacher urging him to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. Mateo felt as if he were being pushed by a current he could not control. At home, his mother maintained her firm stance of letting him decide, but he could see in her as a mixture of pride and concern. Friends, or rather people who now called themselves friends, began speculating which university he would choose. Some guessed as if it were a soccer game. "I bet he's going to MIT. Others joked, "Can you imagine, us here and Mateo living in the USA?" And however enthusiastically it was all said, it made him feel increasingly trapped in a narrative he hadn't chosen. He could no longer breathe easily. He missed the days when no one knew his name. At night, lying in bed, Mateo began to write. He took an old notebook he used for rough drafts and started jotting down his own thoughts, almost as a silent outpouring. "Is that really all I am? Am I just this?" he wrote, without worrying about structure or coherence. They were disjointed phrases, pieces of feelings trying to organize on paper. He didn't see himself as a genius, nor as a prodigy. He only saw himself as a boy who loved numbers because they made sense when the world did not. Numbers do not. Judge, do not pressure. Do not demand that you smile for the cameras or answer interviews. Numbers simply follow a clear, direct, predictable logic. And that was precisely what comforted him. But everything around him now was noise, expectation, and demand. And for the first time, he began to question whether that brilliant path that everyone admired really illuminated what was most true inside him. As the days passed, Mateo started to avoid the busiest corridors of the school. He discreetly changed the time he arrived, preferring to enter a few minutes before the bell rang, when the movement was smaller. At break, he began having lunch in the back garden, a place almost forgotten by the other students, where silence still existed. There, among poorly trimmed trees and old benches with inscriptions worn away by previous generations, he found a bit of peace. But even in those moments, the echo of the decisions he had to make accompanied him. He felt as if every minute that passed, without responding to the universities, was interpreted as an unforgivable delay. "You can't miss this chance," they said. But what if he didn't want that chance? And what if what everyone called destiny was for him just a distraction from what really mattered? One afternoon on his way home, Mateo found Professor Carrasco waiting at the school gate. The scene by itself was unusual. The man who had never mingled with the students before now waited for him outside, holding a leather folder under his arm and with a more sober expression than usual. Mateo hesitated for a few seconds before approaching. "May I walk with you for a bit?" asked Carrasco in an almost restrained tone, without arrogance, without irony. It was the first time his voice sounded human. Surprised, Mateo simply nodded. They walked side by side along the neighborhood streets in silence for a few minutes, until Carrasco, with his eyes fixed on the ground, began to speak. "You know, when you solved those equations, I was angry. Not at you, but at myself, because I realized how trapped I was in a shallow view of education. I underestimated you, and I did it out of pride, and that embarrasses me." Mateo continued walking next to the professor in silence, absorbing every word. It was strange to see him so vulnerable, so different from the imposing and sarcastic figure of the classroom. Carrasco seemed smaller that afternoon, as if the weight of his own reflections had diminished his stature. "For years, I taught mathematics as if it were a weapon. I thought that strictness and pressure produced good students, but now I see that more often than not, they only create fear and erasure," he continued. He stopped for a moment, took a deep breath, and looked directly at Mateo. "You reminded me why I started teaching, and above all, you showed me how much we lose when we ignore the one who sits quietly at the back of the room." The young man listened attentively, but didn't know exactly how to respond. That unexpected, sincere conversation evoked in him a mixture of strangeness and respect. For the first time, he saw the teacher as an ordinary man, fallible, proud, but capable of acknowledging his mistakes. "I didn't come here to convince you to follow any path, Mateo," said Carrasco, resuming his slow pace. "I just wanted you to know that your intelligence is yours, and no one has the right to use it as a trophy. Not the school, not the universities, not the newspapers. You owe nothing to this system. If you want to be a brilliant mathematician, great. But if you just want to be a boy who loves numbers in his own time and in his own way, that's also great." Mateo felt a tightening in his chest. What the professor said seemed to echo what his mother had said days before, but coming from a figure who until then symbolized everything he wanted to avoid. It was in that simple, almost casual conversation that he realized something important. maybe the problem was never mathematics, but rather the way the world dealt with it, as an instrument of pressure and not of expression. In the following days, Mateo began to allow himself to slow down. He stopped responding to messages that demanded urgency. He stopped opening emails with flashy titles and extravagant proposals. He tucked away the letters from the universities in a drawer and left his cell phone on silent mode for longer periods. For the first time since it all began, he returned to studying for pleasure, without external goals, without imposed objectives. He picked up some old books he still kept on his shelf, not to impress anyone, but because he missed that comfortable silence between him and the numbers. It was like reuniting with an old friend, without demands, without the need to prove anything. And in that reunion he rediscovered something that had been lost, the joy of discovery for its own sake, without the need for recognition, without a stage, without an audience. His mother observed everything with care and tenderness. She did not pressure him, did not excessively praise him, just left him space to, day after day, become the master of his own story again. Sometimes they would sit together at the breakfast table without saying much, just sharing the silence of those who understand each other with a glance. Other times they talked for hours about any subject except mathematics. It was as if she too were rediscovering herself in this new phase, learning to trust that her son would find his way without being pushed toward it. And it was in that calm and honest environment that Mateo began, little by little, to sketch what he wanted for his own future. There were no absolute certainties, nor grand plans, but there was something more important: inner clarity. He now knew that his intelligence did not have to be a showcase. It could be just a tool, one among many, to live a life that made sense for him and not for others. Gradually, the school also adjusted to the new reality. The commotion around Mateo subsided over time, like everything that becomes fashionable and then settles. The classmates who had once surrounded him with questions and curiosity now turned their attention to other novelties. Some still greeted him with respect, but most simply went back to their own routines, as if that phenomenon had been just a brief chapter in that year's story. For Mateo, that was a relief. Normality was returning, and with it a comforting feeling that he could exist without being the center of attention. Carrasco, for his part, also changed. His classes began to have a different tone, still demanding, of course, but with less sarcasm and more listening. He started to value the quieter students, to give space to those who were previously ignored. He did not speak directly about Mateo, but it was evident that the experience had left deep marks on his posture as an educator. One day, at the end of class, Carrasco called Mateo to his desk. It wasn't a long conversation, nor an emotional one, just a brief moment in which the teacher handed him an old book on advanced mathematical theory and said with a contained smile, "If you want to study, great. If you don't, that's fine too. But this book helped me a lot when I was your age. Maybe you'll find something in it that makes you think." Mateo took the book with respect, nodded in gratitude, and left the classroom with a curious feeling. It wasn't exactly gratitude nor admiration. It was mutual recognition. Two worlds that had once opposed each other had touched, even if only briefly, and that was enough. That night, he leafed through the book calmly, without haste. He read a few pages, scribbled loose notes, and for the first time thought, maybe studying doesn't have to be an obligation or a destiny, but a choice. And that, in itself, was liberating. On weekends, Mateo began to allow himself small rituals that had previously gone unnoticed. He would walk to the market with his mother, help choose fruits, observe the movement of people with a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. Sometimes he sat on a bench in the square, notebook on his lap, drawing formulas without obligation, just for pleasure. Other times, he merely observed the conversations around him, the simple gestures of ordinary people, and realized how beautiful life could be in its simplicity. He didn't want to be a legend, nor a prodigy. He just wanted to live authentically, feel the world without the constant weight of others' expectations. That sudden fame, which once made him feel trapped, now seemed distant, like a memory of something that no longer defined him. He still received messages, invitations, proposals, but he had learned to ignore what didn't make sense to him, not out of disdain, but out of maturity. Gradually, he also resumed his relationship with some classmates, not the flatterers of his moment of fame, but those few who truly looked him in the eyes and spoke sincerely. One of them was Tomas, a quiet boy passionate about literature, who always sat on the stairs of the courtyard with a book in his lap. They began to exchange ideas, talk about books, about silence, about things that truly mattered. And curiously, it was with Tomas that Mateo talked most about mathematics, not in technical terms, but in the way he saw patterns in the world, how he saw beauty in the logic of things. It was as if, by sharing his passion in an unassuming way, he finally reconnected with it for real. There, in that calm friendship without expectations, Mateo understood that intelligence didn't have to be performance. It could simply be sharing. And that discovery, silent and profound, was perhaps his greatest achievement up to that point. Over time, Mateo came to be seen at school not as the genius, but simply as Mateo, a student like any other, with his own peculiarities, his habits and his preferences. He was still respected for his intelligence, of course, but that ceased to be the only filter through which he was seen. He began to participate more in class, not with brilliant speeches or spectacular demonstrations, but with simple questions, timely observations, and comments that sparked healthy discussions. His previous silence gave way to a more tranquil and conscious presence. He didn't need to hide, but he also didn't need to prove himself. It was a balance he had never experienced before, and now it made perfect sense. Even the teachers changed their tone with him. Some began to treat him as a reference, but with a more humane respect, without idolizing him. Others simply opened up more, listening to him as they would listen to any student who had something to say. And that, for Mateo, was the greatest sign of normalcy. It was in this new context that he made his final decision. Instead of accepting the offers from international universities, he chose to enroll in a simple applied mathematics course at a local college, an institution without international prestige, but with a closer environment, with in-person classes, and the freedom to build his trajectory at his own pace. Some classmates were surprised. Others thought he was wasting potential, but he no longer cared about those comments. He knew what he wanted. He wanted time, he wanted autonomy, he wanted peace. And above all, he wanted to keep mathematics as part of his life, not as a burden, but as a choice. When he received his enrollment confirmation, he felt a strange calm. Not euphoria, not victory, just the good feeling of being in the right place for the right reason. On the last day of high school, Mateo arrived early, as he always did. But there was something different in the air. The school, though still smelling of old paint and cafeteria coffee, seemed lighter. Classmates said their goodbyes with hugs, signed T-shirts, took photos in the corridors. It was that typical day when no one could hide the mix of relief, nostalgia, and fear of what lay ahead. Mateo observed everything with a discreet smile. He participated, but in his own way, without exaggeration, without forced euphoria. He walked through every corner of the school with a more attentive gaze, as if saying goodbye not to the building itself, but to the old version of himself that had inhabited that space for so long. When he entered for the last time the classroom where it all had begun, he looked at the now clean blackboard and felt a flutter in his stomach, not from regret or insecurity, but from the realization that that space, which once imprisoned him, was now just a memory. Before leaving the classroom, he went to his usual desk, the one at the back, next to the window, and sat there for a few minutes. He ran his fingers over the scratched wood of the table, remembering how many times he had wished to disappear there. But now there was no longer a desire to hide. There was belonging, there were scars and stories, and there was also the certainty that no matter how much the world tried to push him into ready-made molds, he had managed to keep the most important thing, his essence. When he stood up and left through the door, he did not look back. He didn't need to. He had already taken with him everything that mattered, the silence he learned to value, the strength to make his own choices, and the calmness of knowing that he was not a prodigy, nor a symbol. He was just Mateo, and that, finally, was enough. The following weeks were a time of adjustment. Life slowed down, and Mateo began to live with more attention to everyday details. The simple routine gained new value, preparing his own breakfast, organizing his study space, reading without haste, walking through the neighborhood, observing things that had previously gone unnoticed. Gradually, he began to feel whole again, without needing to meet expectations, without having to perform genius. He started his course at the local college with the same discretion as always. But now there was a difference. He was there by his own choice, not because someone decided for him, and that made everything lighter. The teachers soon noticed his ease with the material, but instead of making a fuss, Mateo simply discreetly helped his classmates with their doubts, without seeking applause, without wanting to be in the spotlight. He had already learned enough about the price of visibility to know that he did not want that again. Even so, there were those who tried to reactivate his fame. At one point, a journalist discovered that he had turned down all the international universities and tried to write a new article. The genius who chose anonymity. But this time, Mateo simply did not respond. He ignored the emails, blocked the contacts, and continued his life as if nothing had happened. He was determined not to be the character in a story he wasn't writing. He didn't want to be an example, nor a symbol of resistance, nor forced inspiration. He just wanted to be himself, with his achievements, and doubts, with his good and bad days. Gradually, that firm stance began to build around him a new kind of respect, the kind that comes from silence, from authenticity, from the conscious choice not to be molded by applause. And that version of respect was the one that made the most sense to him, because it was real. As the months passed, Mateo created a small study routine alongside college. He set up a simple space in his room with a light wooden desk, an old lamp inherited from his grandfather, and a shelf with a few but good books. There, he explored areas of mathematics that were not part of the curriculum, but that fascinated him. He did it without plans to publish, without ambition for recognition, just for the pleasure of understanding. Sometimes he would spend hours solving a single problem, not because it was difficult, but because he liked to get lost in the reasoning. That made him feel at home within himself. The most curious part was that, precisely because of this unassuming interest, he ended up attracting some classmates who also felt out of place in the competitive university environment. Unintentionally, he formed a small, informal study group where no one needed to prove themselves, where mistakes were part of the process, and where doubt was not a reason for shame, but a starting point. Over time, this group transformed into something bigger. They began organizing open meetings on weekends to exchange knowledge among students from different courses. They called these meetings free studies, without a teacher, without a fixed curriculum, without obligation. Just curious young people sharing knowledge in a horizontal, honest, human way. Mateo became a kind of natural facilitator, but he never positioned himself as the leader. He merely kept the space open, organized materials, and suggested topics. And it was in that collaborative environment, built with simplicity and freedom, that he found something that no international university could ever offer, a place where knowledge served to connect, not to hierarchize. And there, in that improvised study room in an old community center, he realized that perhaps the meaning of his intelligence was not in where it could take him, but in how it could serve something greater than himself. One afternoon, at the end of one of the free studies meetings, A young first-year student approached Mateo. She carried a notebook full of notes and a timid but determined expression. "Do you think I'm dumb for not understanding integral calculus?" she asked directly, almost challengingly. Mateo smiled gently without irony and replied with the same serenity he usually used with himself. "Of course not. We just need a different amount of time to understand certain things, and no one learns anything while being judged." That brief conversation became a habit. The student began attending the meetings more frequently, and gradually other students with similar stories started showing up. People who had abandoned courses out of insecurity, who had never had the space to err without fear. The group grew, not through marketing, but through genuine acceptance. And this discreet movement gained silent strength. Teachers began to support it. The community center lent them a larger room, and a different atmosphere started to form around the initiative. One of knowledge that brings people together, not one that separates. Observing all of this, Mateo felt something different. It wasn't pride nor vanity. It was a rare kind of peace, that which is born when life finally moves in tune with who you truly are inside. Sometimes he thought about how different everything would have been if he had accepted the invitations from foreign universities. He would probably be in another country, with another pace, another setting. But curiously, there was no regret. He knew that that choice, as unusual as it might have seemed to outsiders, was the one that made sense for him. He knew that even far from headlines and lights, he was living a whole, coherent, real trajectory. And that was enough, because in the end, that was what he had been seeking from the beginning. A life that didn't need to be extraordinary to be deeply meaningful. A few years passed. Mateo had already finished college, but he remained involved with the Free Studies project. The group had grown so much that it transformed into an official extension program of the university, with institutional support, volunteers from various fields, and even partnerships with public schools. Curiously, even with all that progress, Mateo still maintained the same discreet posture as always. He declined formal positions, titles, or honors. He preferred to stay behind the scenes, organizing materials, welcoming new participants, and preparing simple snacks for the meetings. He never got used to speeches or ceremonies. He found it more meaningful to talk with someone after a difficult class than to receive a trophy. And that was what he did. He built bridges in silence, empowered people without them immediately noticing, leaving his mark not with spotlights, but with presence. It was at one of those meetings that he met Carrasco again. The professor, now retired, had been invited by one of the coordinators to see the project. When he entered the room, he recognized Mateo from afar, and for a moment, just observed him in silence, arranging chairs with the same ease as years ago. When he approached, the two greeted each other with a firm handshake and a sincere smile. Carrasco walked around the space, watched part of the activities, and at the end said quietly, almost in a whisper, "Now I understand. You didn't choose the easiest path. You chose the truest one." Mateo just nodded. There was no need for many words. That phrase, coming from someone who had once tried to reduce him to an equation, now carried a different weight. It was a silent acknowledgement, without fanfare but full of meaning. And in that moment, Mateo was sure there was no formula more precise than living a life true to who you are, even if the whole world expects something else. Over time, Mateo realized that the value of his choices lay not only in the results they produced, but in the impact they had on the people around him. Many of the students who passed through the Free Studies did not become renowned mathematicians or scientists, but they became something even more essential: confident, curious people with the courage to learn at their own pace. Some pursued careers in other fields, others went back to studying after years away. Several recounted, in simple testimonials, how that space had changed their relationship with learning, how they had finally stopped feeling ashamed of making mistakes. And upon hearing these accounts, Mateo always felt a quiet warmth in his chest, a mixture of gratitude and humility. He wasn't trying to be a reference, but he knew he was helping to build a more humane path within a system that so often was cruel to those who didn't fit the standards. One day, while organizing old papers, Mateo found the notebook in which he had written his doubts years earlier, right after the episode with Carrasco. He read each sentence carefully, as if visiting a past version of himself. "Am I just this?" was written on one of the pages, and he smiled upon rereading it. It was strange to realize how much he had changed since then, and yet how his essence remained intact. Yes, he still loved mathematics, but now he knew that it did not define him completely. It was a part of him, not the whole. He closed the notebook slowly and stored it in a drawer with care, not as if he were forgetting, but as if he understood that certain chapters needed to be cherished and kept, not to guide the future, but to remind him where he came from. Because in the end, it was that awareness that made all the difference. The ability to choose one's own path, without haste, without labels, and with truth. That same day, as he left home for an afternoon walk, Mateo encountered a boy sitting alone in one of the neighborhood squares. The boy was probably around 13, with headphones on, a notebook on his lap, but with a distracted look. Something in that silence caught his attention. He approached slowly, without invading the boy's space, and simply said, "Need some help with that?" The boy hesitated, but showed his notebook. It was a basic algebra problem, but poorly solved, full of confusing annotations. Mateo sat beside him on the bench and began to explain calmly, without rush, sketching possibilities, showing paths, asking before answering. The boy looked at him in surprise, not at the content, but at the way he was treated. No one was there to judge him, and that in itself made everything seem easier. When he finished, the boy thanked him with a timid smile. Mateo just replied, "If you like this, go ahead. But if you don't, that's fine too." The important thing is to understand that making mistakes isn't the end. On his way home, Mateo thought about that brief encounter. So simple, so small, yet so full of meaning. That was what he wanted for himself. Real moments, where knowledge didn't alienate, but embraced. Where no one needed to conform to a standard to be valued. Where learning was a bridge, not a pedestal. He looked at the darkening sky, felt the cold wind on his face, and took a deep breath. He felt whole, complete, exactly where he should be. And even knowing that life would still bring challenges, he no longer carried the fear of not being enough, because he now knew that being enough wasn't about meeting others' expectations. It was about being honest with who you are and walking firmly in your own direction, even if it seemed less brilliant to the world. A few months later, Mateo was invited to give a lecture at a public school in the region. At first, he thought of refusing. He had never liked being the center of attention, much less in front of a full auditorium. But something inside him said that this invitation was different. It wasn't about status or recognition. It was an opportunity to speak with young people who, like him in the past, might be feeling invisible, out of place, pressured to fit into spaces that did not embrace them. So he accepted. He prepared some simple notes, nothing elaborate with slides or sophisticated charts. When he took the stage, he took a deep breath, looked at that room full of restless teenagers and began, "I didn't come here to teach mathematics. I came to say that it's okay not to know who you are yet. It's okay not to be the best, not to be the standout, not to want to shine all the time." His speech was direct, without embellishments, but every word seemed to find a home in the attentive eyes of the audience. Mateo recounted his story with honesty, without heroism, without victimhood. He spoke of silence, of exposure, of doubts, and of the choice not to follow the expected path. And he ended by saying something that stuck in many minds. Life will try to push you into a mold, but you can always say no. You can be amazing without being extraordinary, and that is more than enough. In the end, the applause came, but not in an exuberant way. It came as a respectful, genuine, quietly emotional gesture. Many students approached afterward, not to ask for autographs or selfies, but simply to say thank you. And that kind of recognition, coming from those who truly felt touched, was the most valuable Mateo had ever received, because it was real and it was human. On the way back home, after that lecture, Mateo felt a different kind of tranquility. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes when everything is solved, but the one that arises when you know you're on the right path, even with uncertainties. He looked out the bus window, seeing the city lights blinking at the end of the afternoon, and thought about everything that had changed since. That day in the classroom, when Carrasco tried to expose him, he thought about the silent journey, the choices made against the current, the moments when he doubted himself, but above all, he thought about how he had remained true to what he felt was real. Not everyone understood his decisions, and that was fine. He no longer sought to be understood by everyone, but rather to be at peace with his own conscience, and that was the rarest freedom anyone could achieve. Arriving home, he found his mother sitting on the sofa, as she did almost every night, with a blanket on her knees and a book in her hands. She looked up when he entered and smiled with that look that said everything without saying a word. "How was it?" she asked softly. Mateo smiled back, put his backpack on the floor, and simply replied, "It was good. It was very good." He sat next to her, sharing the comfortable silence that exists only between people who understand each other deep in their souls. That was real life. That was belonging. He didn't need stages or trophies, because he had already found what so many spend their lives searching for, a place where he could be himself, without disguises. And, no matter how much the world still tried to label him from time to time, he now knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who has walked his own path, that no one has the right to define what you should be when you finally learn to be whole inside. Sometime later, Mateo returned to his old school, not as a celebrated alumnus, nor as the revealed genius. He was simply visiting a teacher friend who still worked there and who had participated in the free studies project. While he waited for her at the entrance, he passed through the corridors that once suffocated him. Now, everything seemed smaller, less intimidating. The walls still bore the same posters, the same flyers for science fairs and Olympiads, but nothing pressured him anymore. He paused for a few seconds in front of the old classroom, peered through the slightly open door, and saw students laughing, talking, distracted by everyday school life. He smiled to himself. That place no longer belonged to him, but it left in him a transformed memory, not one of pain or discomfort, but of overcoming. It was as if that space had ceased to be a place of forced silence and had become part of the journey that made him who he was. As he left the school, he took a deep breath, looked at the blue sky, and felt a gentle wind brush his face, simple every day, but full of symbolism. It was the closing of a cycle, not one of grand ceremonies with applause, but an intimate, quiet ending, like a page turned gently. He no longer needed to prove anything, neither to himself nor to anyone else. His greatest achievement had not been solving complex equations, winning medals, or turning down prestigious universities. His greatest achievement was having had the courage to say no to what made no sense, and yes to what made his heart at peace. And even today, even as life goes on with new challenges arising, Mateo remains steadfast in this purpose, to live truthfully. And perhaps that is what truly makes him extraordinary, not for everything he knows, but for everything he has chosen to be. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.